All right. Welcome to another episode of the Metacast. Today, I am joined by NorthHugr, otherwise known as just Matt, I guess, where, you have that on the name tag. So I feel like I'm not, saying anything I shouldn't be saying here, but I am very excited. I've been following your stuff for a long time. I think you've been doing documentary work and whatnot, and like actually going out and meeting people, which is awesome. And you just launched this recent documentary called Lost Gods, which I've watched I think twice now. So once when you kind of sent me the early version, and again when I was kind of prepping for this, finding some good clips for us to go through. So it's been really cool kind of following that journey and hearing about it and finally seeing the culmination of the work. So I'm super excited to have you on and to dive more in depth on this topic as well, because I think the rise of neo-paganism, I just made a post on it, and like already it's blown up. A lot of people have a lot of strong opinions. So thanks again for coming on the show. And I'd love to give you the chance to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about this new documentary.
Hey, well, thank you so much for having me on, Meta. Yeah, it's fun to be on the show. Finally get to talk about this project that's been brewing for a long time. It was maybe about 4 months of just trip planning and pre-production that went into it, trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to structure this? What topics are we going to cover? Just pages and pages of documents of notes, and here's all the questions I want to ask, and what do I want to cover? Quotations from like books and sagas and stuff that I thought were important to get over. But I guess in a nutshell, the documentary it's a little bit experimental because it's a dialectic. It's a back and forth. It's a conversation between myself, a Lutheran theologian, and Tom Rousel, who many of you know as Survived the Jive. And we also brought with Ian Bington, who's a TikTok, Instagram growing rising star. So he was with it was really funny because we realized we're like, well, we have space for one more guy on the trip. And I'd reached out to a handful of guys, and then right at the last minute, it was like a week before we did the trip, and Ian got back to me. And Ian and I hadn't even really interacted that much before the trip, and then he gets back to me. He's like, I want to do this. I want to make this happen. He's like, I'm married now. I'm like just done with college. I want to have a big adventure here before domestic life kicks in. So yeah, so Ian hopped on, was a lot of fun to have with, brought a lot into kind of the middle portion of the documentary. But initially it was kind of, the impetus was, I had a friend reach out to me, and he was saying, okay, I really want to travel around to some place that's like pretty exotic. So it was either going to be Greenland. We were thinking, we're like, yeah, we want to get out to Greenland because there's cool history in Greenland. If you fly to Europe and back on the plane, you often fly by Greenland. So you look at it from the plane, it's this like ice castle wonderland. It looks insane. It looks just otherworldly, like another planet of just like ice mountains as far as you can see. Just extraordinary. I'm like, I want to check that out. And the other place that we had on our list was Svalbard, which is way up. You think of Norway as being super high up. Norway goes like several hundred kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, like probably about 500 kilometers north. And then above that, there's a huge gap of ocean. As you're getting into the Arctic Ocean up there, there's another landmass, which is called Svalbard. And it's this like really big island. There's a Russian settlement there. There's a Norwegian settlement there. Sparsely populated. So we were thinking initially one of those. We didn't end up actually going to either because as I was kind of reaching out about, I'd seen a tweet from Tom because I've been following his work for a while. I think if you're interested in history, the Iron Age, religion, topics that relate to the development and the history of religion, Christianity, paganism in Europe, Tom's a big figure in that space and has done a lot of impressive work on that. So I saw Tom had made some tweet about what should I do next. I reached out to him. I just said, hey, I'm planning on doing this big trip. Don't know if that interests you. And then we ended up collaborating. I said, okay, maybe we should pivot the documentary a bit or turn it into a documentary, because I wasn't sure if it would be a documentary at the time. But what was inspiring it was kind of this idea in the back of our minds of like traveling to the extremes, going out to this sort of, I've always felt for a long way, I've always had this sort of intuitive desire to travel north, to go northward or westward. Like these are the
Mhm.
directions. Some part of my internal compass is always like yearning
Sure.
to go either further north or further west. It's like
Mhm.
these are just kind of, I don't know if it's an instinctual thing, a cultural thing. Where
Yeah,
they
it's like
come.
birds migrating.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we ended up playing it with Tom, and we're like, well, there's a huge opportunity here because there's so many of the Norse sagas from that were written down like around the 1200s often. Um, and these are sagas really about the Iron Age and
Mhm.
about the days of the Vikings. And so much of that literature has influenced so many other pieces of literature down through the ages, Shakespeare. Um, and we were thinking, well, Iceland is this treasure trove of where many of these sagas took place, where many of them were written down. The sagas take place all over the Viking world. Like they're kind of these country hopping adventures that go, you get stories that go all the way through the Kievan Rus and through the Byzantine Empire, all the way over to Ireland, over to Finland, to the New World. So but Iceland is kind of the literary nexus of that.
Mhm.
And we had some local connections, or I had some local connections in Iceland that I was able to connect with, and some friends out there that wanted to help out with this and thought it was a really cool idea. So without that help, it wouldn't have been possible. But we ended up making the documentary partly around Tom, partly as kind of like a little bit of an insight into how Tom works, how he thinks, him out in the field doing what he does and making content. So it's a little bit of a behind the scenes look at what Tom does. But then
Mhm.
also embedded in that, it's guys like myself and Ian who are really seeking adventure. We're both from America.
Sure.
We're more disconnected from so much of this European history when it comes to a day to day level. So we're trying to kind of tap in and see, okay, there's all this history and epic heroism that really fascinates us and draws us, that I think it's alluring to really everyone. But I think especially if you're a young guy, it's like,
Mhm.
yeah, we want to live cool, exciting lives, and you look to like the characters from the sagas and from history, and you go, yeah, I want to be like that.
Mhm.
They were doing something so cool that it's been written down and lasted for 1,000 years. So like there's a way of living that they had, or a way of experiencing the world that we're trying to learn from.
Mhm.
And our thought is, well, by going to these places, by going to the sites of the sagas,
Sure.
by reading the history, by trying to understand like the mindset, the medieval mindset, the Viking mindset, the heroic saga mindset, how did they see the world differently than what we do? And then going to some of the actual locations. So going out to Norway, going across Iceland, doing a big road trip in Iceland, uh, going to like a big reconstructed Viking hall where there used to be one 1,000 years ago, and trying to experience that and soak that in. So, and then throughout all that, it's like we're also kind of going through the same spiritual matters that were wrestled with 1,000 years ago as well. So,
Mhm.
a huge part of the Viking age starts out what we would say like pagan or heathen, the Norse gods, the Germanic gods. That was the pantheon, and then over time that transitioned through a mix of conversion and warfare over to Christianity.
Mhm.
And so we're kind of going through what we're our own version of that, because in some ways these questions, I think, which seem like they're questions of the past, are becoming increasingly relevant today.
Sure.
And I mean, this is partly something you find more online, of course,
Mhm.
because the online is where you get people of different niches
Sure.
communicating and arguing and fighting. It's a little more sensational in that way, but it's
Mhm.
also aesthetically evocative.
Mhm.
So we wanted to really kind of get to the heart of that, and we figured there was an appetite out there for people wanting to see media around this, and media that's like as high quality as we could do on a basically shoestring budget.
Hey,
So
I mentioned earlier we have some clips prepared, and one of the clips, I mean, the vast majority, the documentary is just gorgeous, right? Like the cinematography is fantastic. So I am curious to hear, this. How did you get shoestring budget to turn into this kind of stuff?
well, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear it. The goal was to focus, because a lot of this does have an aesthetic quality to it.
Hmm.
I think a lot of what draws people towards paganism or towards history, it's like great works of art, it's depictions of characters and landscapes that are really evocative. So I wanted to capture that as much on film as I could. So, and
Hmm.
I'm a videographer full time for my day to day life.
Hmm.
So I was able to take a lot of that and take some of the things I was inspired by, haul a bunch of really heavy camera gear and lenses out there, fit them in my
Hmm.
backpack. Try not to have too many things break during transit and going through security 100 times.
Sure.
Process. But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised with how it turned out. I had gotten my EASA drone license and liability coverage and all that taken care of right before the trip to make sure everything was squared away. So I
Sure.
did some cool stuff, and then occasionally pull a couple shots from stock footage where I needed to fill in something that I couldn't get directly.
Mhm.
But yeah, we were able to get some really cool material. We figured part of that was down to the planning because
Mhm.
we wanted to plan out. We're like, all right, let's hit as many cool places as we can hit. Ton of research in advance to try to find
Mhm.
cool spots, and we were only still scratching the surface at either place for like where the most stunning locations are and the most historically relevant locations are. Like you can spend pretty much your whole life just out there. There's so much. But yeah, I spent a lot of time trying to make sure I had the right kind of lens choices. I had an anamorphic super 35 millimeter lens for a while. That was a
Mhm.
lot of the shot. So that gave a really unique look with a lot of character to the lens. Some of it was shot spherical as well. But we were even something like trying to get tripods out in Iceland was a challenge because I almost
Really?
ordered some in advance. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
I almost ordered some in advance and had them shipped there. I was like, well, it's super expensive shipping fees, like $200 to ship anything to Iceland
Uh-huh.
because it's island way out in the middle of nowhere. And then
Yep.
everything in Iceland is about 4x more expensive or 5x more expensive than in America.
Really?
Yeah, it's pretty nuts. But we ended up like for the interviews because I'm like, well, we need at least like 2 tripods for the interviews to set up a dual camera setup.
Mhm.
Ideally, I'd love to have more cameras and do something really high end
Sure.
and have a crew and all that. But
Yeah,
you
yeah.
got to work with what you've got.
Mhm.
So yeah, so we went around. We went to an electronic shop, and they're like, well, we have this tripod over here. It's like a really cheap plastic tripod, but it's like $200.
Yeah.
Like I don't know about that. So we got these like just stands for for like little social media ring lights.
Yep.
So I bought 2 of those for like I don't know $150 for 2 of these
Mhm.
little things, and then like well we don't need the lights, so we just like threw away the lights and just screwed them on, and they're not actually tripods, so we just kind of mounted them and like put them around.
Yep.
Yeah, so there's a lot of improv. I could go into some of the stories of production. It was pretty crazy, but yeah, I mean, so far people seem to mostly like it, so pretty happy about that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it sounds like it's a very cool subject to be diving into. Some very interesting people, right? But the recording everything sounds like it was basically an adventure in and of itself, right? Like a whole nother layer of complexity and difficulty.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, I mean, if anyone listening to this hasn't checked out the video, the documentary, definitely go and check it out. We're going to show a few clips shortly here, kind of dive into a little bit of the content itself, because honestly, I think that you couldn't have picked a better time to release this documentary, right? I
Mm,
think that the conversation online is starting to really turn to this question of, okay, what do we do? What is like the personal life that we have? Because I think what spurred a lot of people to get online in the first place was just how kind of disconnected the mainstream delusion, as I call it, right? This kind of unhealthy way of being is from what we inherently feel should be, like we're looking for something better. We're looking for a better way of being, a better structure for how to understand the world around us. And I think when people first got online, it was to kind of illustrate all the problems that was wrong with society. Like, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, crime, yada yada, right? But now I think a lot of people are realizing, hey, look, like we've kind of talked the problems to death. maybe we can hope that on the national level those things start to move in the right direction, but that ball is already rolling, and it's largely out of our hands. What matters now is, what do we do as individuals, as a group, right? Because no one's going to fix your own life but yourself, right? Nothing's going to change unless you actually go out and change it. Just having discussions on the internet, as informative as they can be, right? Like, they are nothing without actual implementation. Like, knowledge is nothing without implementation. And so I think that's the direction that the conversation is going. And obviously one of the most fundamental parts of that conversation is, how do you have that connection with the divine, right? With God, with spirituality. And I think a lot of people, especially in the comments from the post that I made earlier today, a lot of people see Christianity as being very kind of mainstreamified. It's kind of fallen into the alignment with the kind of the delusional nature of this mainstream delusion that we have, right? And that turns people off, right? They're like, I don't want to have my relationship with the divine, with God, kind of tainted by that, right? And it's really hard for me to try and find a church where I don't feel like that kind of agenda is being pushed. And I think rightly so. And, kind of Tom brings up in the documentary, there's something to be said for looking further back, for looking into the culture, into your ancestry, and how they understood religion, how they had a connection with the divine. I'm a big believer in, one of the things that we're really missing in today's age is a connection to the land, a connection to history, right? That used to be so important. And now, you grow up somewhere, like, you have your community, your friend group, kind of, at least for me as a millennial, that stuff was still kind of a thing. But then you go to college, and then usually go to some other part of the country for your job. And, you're not really around your family or your community. And, like, the idea that, your family owns a plot of land where, your ancestral family was buried or something like that is just such a foreign idea to Americans. It just does not exist, that connection. And so, so I think people are looking to rediscover a connection with divinity, and neo-paganism seems to be one of the opportune ways to do that. Obviously, there's this kind of push-pull between the Christians and the neo-pagans, because, unfortunately, I think that they believe that their, ideologies put them at, their theologies put them at odds with each other. But yeah, all of that to say, I think you've kind of been able to put this documentary out right as this discussion is starting to reach a fever pitch, that the zeitgeist really wants to talk about it. And so, I'd be curious to hear, like, a little bit of maybe what turns you on to this as a topic, and then kind of any of the insights that you've been having as we go. And then we can definitely play the clip that kind of talks a little bit about this early on, in a bit.
Brilliant. Yeah. I think that's a really good way to summarize it, because, and there's a good connection there too. I mean, we're both Americans, whatever that means these days. It's increasingly ambiguous, but it is that experience of, and this was something that was touched on in my prior documentary when I went to, which was kind of focused on being part of a diaspora in America, seeing your homeland for the first time, and like, what's that experience like, and talking to people there. And one of the comments that was made was by a Norwegian friend there, who's, he was still in the same area he'd grown up in all his life, and was talking, we were just kind of talking about the American experience and how much Americans move. And he was just shocked, because I think the average American moves maybe, was it like 12 times or more? It's a lot. And sometimes, and often people come back to places where they grew up, or they still have some connection to family. But yeah, I mean, we are very nomadic here in the States. We tend to kind of jump on opportunities.
It's a very weird term for, like, Americans to hear, but I think it's a very apt description.
Nomadic.
Yeah.
And, in some ways, it's not all bad, because I think there's an enterprising nature in American culture that a lot of Americans have, a willingness to just go out there and attack things and try to build things. I think that's really exciting. But there also are, you do get to this experience of alienation, or the feeling of, not being tied to the land or the area in the same way. And you kind of lose the distinctiveness of regional cultures. and you get this sort of mass homogenization of culture in the same way. And certainly the internet in its own way has that effect too digitally, because it sort of has this effect of everyone's familiar with the same references and the same, and that's a global effect too. So like, it was a weird experience how in some ways we are probably more connected to our countrymen back home in Sweden or Ireland, in the sense that we would understand a lot of the same cultural references, memes online, like obscure things, like your tribe and your cultural connection is defined in some ways a lot more by the niche of the internet that you're in, and what streamer you follow and what YouTuber you watch, and where, like, what TV show you've seen, and where you get your philosophy from. Like, these things define your cultural niche a lot more than even being in a country. So that was my experience when I went to Norway. It's like, yeah, it was people who I connected with through being a mutual on TikTok. And then even though we had lived apart for like 150 years after separation through migration, we come back and we're like, yeah, we're just on the same level. Like, we understand each other better because we're in the same cultural niche through TikTok than I understand with my neighbor who lives down the street.
Sure. I think that there's like, you can think of it almost as a language, right?
Yeah.
That these cultural references, these memes are like a shared language. And this is something when I've written about communication and I've talked about memes and meme culture, how these are kind of like a hack, right? Because there's so much like high density information contained in a meme, like the reference, right? Like, people just are able to see, oh, see that meme, and I like know the nuanced kind of emotion or concept that it's trying to convey. And to your point, right, we have these, content creators or people or whatever, and it's like, if you reference that, you kind of know where people sit in like the ideological, universe, right?
Definitely. Yeah. And you were also asking about how I got interested in this topic. Yeah. Where would I start? Because one way to look at it is, if you're into history, like my channel started out primary focus being history. To some extent, it still is. I still want to keep creating history content. But what you find when you spend a lot of time in history or studying different eras of history is, like, it becomes pretty apparent that from one era to the next, people's moral assumptions, people's underlying beliefs about what is right and wrong, it flips constantly, and it's just constantly turning. And every, like, just a few generations apart, people are always doing things and living in ways that are entirely like unthinkable to prior generations. So when you spend enough time in history, I think if you have enough self-awareness about where you fit in the present age, you have to come to terms with the fact that whatever the values that have been instantiated with you in this time are, it's probably going to be significantly different in the future. We probably have not reached the final stage of what normative values are. And that goes religiously, that goes culturally, fashion, it applies to everything. It's like, although there are certain, you could say, perennial truths about what ways of acting in society tend to lead to a better structured civilization. Like, there are those qualities, like if you have rampant murder all the time, pretty obvious that tends to destabilize the civilization and not lead it to not function. If you have rampant promiscuity, that tends to have similar effects as well.
Yeah.
So there are some universals where there is, especially historically, there's kind of a counterweight where if you go too off the rails in some ways, you can destabilize your civilization and it collapses. So there are some values that kind of stick around just through a sort of natural selection process of civilizations. But there are, I think especially when you get to the modern age, there's a deferral of consequence due to technology. So if I am slothful and I don't till my fields, well, that doesn't actually hurt me too much because I don't have fields and I don't need to deal with that because there's like a safety net. And if I behave improperly, I can defer the consequences. And we have enough efficiency in production and how we run society and heating and air conditioning, that we can kind of survive making a lot more mistakes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think when it comes to wanting to understand our current paradigm, it is worth just putting ourselves in the mindset of thinking, well, okay, maybe the values that we're given, maybe some of them are correct. Maybe we shouldn't just like tear down all the fences without thinking it through. But if we really want to start looking for solutions to questions of our age, I think we need to be willing to look at some of these sacred cows and think, maybe a couple of them we gotta consider putting in another field or getting rid of. Maybe we got to bring in some new sacred cows that are better sacred cows. And that, that's why I find these conversations so interesting. And what I found too, when it came to the pagan Christian discourse online, a lot of it happening on Twitter, especially Twitter X, a lot of it's frankly just pretty low quality.
Sure.
And, they're smart people, but part of it's the format of X, and Twitter's always been this way. It's it's getting people to try to dunk on each other, but a lot of people aren't going into it with the attempt of trying to get anything out of it or try to learn from the other side. Call this a cringe, normie, centrist take or whatever, but I think it's less about what's the center position and more about, are there lessons we can learn? Are there things we can learn from each other? For example, I'm a Christian. Like, that's important to me. I have no interest in apostatizing from my faith or anything, but it's a question of like, well, maybe the reason that paganism and heathenry are regrowing is because maybe they have some good points about stuff, or maybe they're seeing things that the rest of us aren't. And I think a lot of people today can feel this sort of dissatisfaction, or they can feel an allure towards ways of viewing the world, aesthetic instincts they have that are more aligned with what pagans are doing. And I think a lot of pagans are embarking on this project of rediscovering history that has been kind of swept to the side or forgotten. And you did see some of this, like I talk about this to some extent. It's like you had the Romantic movement in the 19th century. You have figures obviously like Richard Wagner, but you even have like painters like Hans Dahl, August Wilhelm Lew. They're painting these masterworks, and they're kind of looking back, and they're creating these stories of national and civilizational epics, and they're romanticizing and idealizing the past, but they're tapping into like, well, why do we love this so much? What is the beauty in there that we can bring to our age? And that stuff that kind of took off at that time, but it didn't really last. I think there is still this desire almost for maybe I just love romantic artwork and romantic stories, but there's this quality that I think is really lacking. I think you see it the most obviously in America, where let's say you're a Christian and you go to your church, but the music that you listen to, it's just kind of like not very good pop music from 30 years ago. The architecture is in many ways more about utility than about beauty or stylistically something that's influenced by the heritage of the church. And you go there and it just kind of feels like you're in a shopping mall or you're at like a cheap rock concert. And a lot of people find that off-putting. Some people do like it. So
sure. Yeah,
I don't think that's
it's
necessarily
probably a familiar thing for those people.
Yeah, it's
not
familiar,
so much like a quality thing.
Right, and it's comfortable. But the point of any religion, I don't think should be to be comfortable. It should be to inspire or instill awe or challenge you.
Yeah,
aspirational indeed. Yeah. So, and I think that's certainly why like, I'm not Catholic, but Catholics are sometimes drawn to the mysterious quality of Latin rites, or they're drawn to, or people. I have friends that were drawn more to Eastern Orthodoxy because there's a sense of sort of awe about it. It's a different tradition. It's kind of a very Eastern thing, and I think that's also to an extent why people especially in the past, were more drawn. Like, there's kind of a movement. I don't know if you probably saw this a lot back in the day, and maybe this was more like a 2000s and 90s and 80s thing. It was like people drawn to the East, people drawn to Buddhism and Hinduism, and
Sure.
there's all
Yeah.
the wisdom in the Orient that we can
Hmm.
pull from, and there's this sense that it's like mysterious and out there.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of the rundown of kind of how I got interested in this stuff. But I also wanted to see, I'm like, well, I haven't seen anyone else do a documentary style piece about this. I've seen interviews, but I haven't seen anyone really do like a good faith conversation where people aren't just trying to dunk on each other
Sure.
and they're actually trying to like maybe see if there's something we can get to. So like, for example, as Christians, like something we can learn from that is, well, maybe something we can learn from what the pagans are doing is, yeah, maybe there are some really incredible things in our own past. For myself, Scandinavian American, so I'm like, well, what's in our past? Like, there's so many inspiring stories, just epic tales. Our ancient styles of architecture, like our stave churches, just mind-bendingly cool to me, and that stuff fires me up so much, and that is like just the artwork of that time. It's like it resonates with me so much and resonates with
Mm,
a lot of people because there is this deeper quality to it. It's more connected literally to the earth. It's like this sort of
mm,
masterful woodworking and artistry and carving, and there's this, the stories are like carved into the buildings, and there's this sort of naturalistic quality to it that is just unlike anything else we have today. It's like
yeah.
maybe we did lose something in the process of upgrading to our new modern churches and facilities and
Yeah.
forms of worship. It's like maybe there is something that we lost there, and maybe the pagans are kind of rediscovering that. And also, I think what happens too sometimes is people online will claim, they'll be like, well, anything, if you look at a stave church or a mead hall or a Viking ship, it's like this is an expression of paganism, and if you look at what we have today, that's an expression of Christianity.
Mm,
But I think really it's more like, well, this is just an expression of who we are throughout history, and the
hmm.
religion is kind of the element that sits on top of that or infuses that. So that would be my take too. I could probably explain that better with more time and a more written out form. But
Well, yeah, just go watch the documentary, right? If you
right,
want
right.
you want the condensed version of these ideas, because I do think that it does a great job. In fact, this might be a good time to transition to that clip. I don't know if you have it
Yeah, let's
ready.
do
I
it.
think it's the 604 one, but it illustrates really well this concept that we're talking about here. This impetus and interest in, you know, why are so many people getting interested in neo-paganism? Um, and I think you're absolutely right that to me, and I'll say this while you're kind of pulling it up here. To me, I think what's important is that modern religion feels like an echo. It feels like a copy of a copy of a copy. It doesn't feel like there's this direct connection with divinity, right? And we have this term gnosis, which is that knowing, right? And I think that to me, when you're talking about going out and trying to rediscover this thing and put yourself in that shoes, I think that's really what it sounds to me like you're searching for is like a Gnostic understanding of these deeper transcendent things. And to me, that is what neo-paganism is about, right? It's
Hmm.
okay, how do we get back to a direct understanding of the divine instead of this kind of commercialized cookie cutter, bad concert, bad architecture thing that you're talking about here? Like, you'd much rather have hand carved woodwork in your church and have a smaller church, or kind of a less technologically advanced church, right? Then have this mega church that feels very devoid of like actual spirit and life. So
Right, right. Well,
um
and you raised a good point too. It's I've talked a lot about the look and the feel and stuff, but there also is the values quality too, where a lot of churches, they've kind of imbibed a lot of the premises of modernity. And they've
mm,
taken on a lot of the values and have just, in some ways, unfortunately, become kind of a mouthpiece for whatever the politics of the day are, whether they realize it consciously or not. I think,
yeah.
like any institution, they're vulnerable. Like, if the people are propagandized to think a certain way, to exchange the values of their religion for values of the age,
Mm,
then they just become a mouthpiece for the spirit of the age. they may have they may not be, totally without merit, but that is always the temptation and the challenge, especially in an age of mass media, which we have now.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
yeah, how long? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're all good. I was just quickly going to say that is one of my frustrations with a lot of modern churches. I don't feel like the clergy and the priest, and when they're talking about these things, I understand trying to apply this philosophy, this theology to the modern world, and that is a necessity. But I think you're right; they get very influenced by the mainstream and kind of end up just proselytizing, mainstream ideology as opposed to transcendent philosophy or theology. Yeah, you'll know, I think, if you hit play. And I think what I want to encourage people to check out when they're looking at this is the cinematography. I think it is gorgeous. But I think this is also a really great way to kind of illustrate yours and Tom's. I think he's talking about what is kind of the impetus for this movement, and so we kind of get to hear it in his own words. And I think you'll know when to cut it. He kind of finishes his thought. So I'll let you take it from here.
So my interest in paganism began, as I said, very early, 2006. It was sort of like galvanized by reading Nietzsche and seeing the way he was so inspired by the classics. I was also learning about Aztec religion, about Egyptian religion, like Roman religion. My interest was broadly in paganism. Native American custom was just like, I'm not an atheist anymore. I know I had enough experiences to understand that atheism was wrong, but I didn't know what my religion was. And then as I studied pre-Christian and polytheistic cultures in general, it was very clear that the idea of a religion is inappropriate to talk about it. You don't really choose a religion. The correct way of practicing polytheism is to practice the polytheism of your ancestors, of your culture. And I recognized, okay, well, I'm English. So what is English polytheism? And a lot of people in Britain mistakenly believe that should be Celtic, but it isn't really, because the English ethnogenesis in the early Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, was always Germanic, and the culture has been, there's a constant, unbroken tradition linking us to the English ethnic group. We still call ourselves the English ethnic group, which is a term used in Anglo-Saxon England. Anglo-Saxon is a synonym of English, and the word English predates the word Anglo-Saxon. So these people called themselves English before they called themselves Anglo-Saxons. So it's not like two different things. And those people worshipped Woden, and they worshipped these Germanic gods. And although we can understand a bit about Anglo-Saxon,
is that about where you wanted to place you?
Yeah. So the big thing that he's getting at there that I wanted to talk about was this kind of idea. So two things, and we touched on them earlier. One is, we have this connection to the past, right? And that is probably the best way to understand who we are, right? I think I have friends who practice more Eastern religious ideas, or they're into the Vedic traditions, which are still kind of Aryan in origin, but they kind of have their own kind of cultural flavor, so to speak. And a big part of that is, well, people are different, right? One of the harsh truths of our age, for whatever reason it is. And I think a lot of their theology is influenced by what works for them, right? I think of this stuff as, theology is a framework for having a relationship with the divine. And part of that is how to live a moral, well-oriented life. And I believe that there are objectively correct, transcendent laws on which morality is based, right? We were talking a little bit about this earlier. And I think the distinction that I would articulate is, say, for example, you live in a culture where there is rampant criminality, right? And you might think to yourself, okay, well, I have to be dangerous as well. I need to be willing to defend myself. And that might be, the willingness to use lethal violence in order to keep myself and my family safe, right? And you might think, well, that's a very different thing than, a Christian morality or something like that, right? But I would, and this is, I think, where there's a little bit of difficulty to kind of look past a lot of the literal understandings of morality, like this idea of thou shalt not kill, right? To me, that's not saying, you can't ever kill someone, right? It's more of like, well, unnecessary murder is bad, right? And to me, I think one of the transcendent moral rules is minimum necessary force, right? If you're in a tough situation, right, you want to default to using as little force as you can to get through that situation in the right way. That being said, sometimes it's hard to just discern what minimum necessary force is, and so I don't fault people sometimes for being more protective or whatever than they need to be. But when you're exacting justice, right, one of the hallmarks of good justice is you are not punishing that person in a sadistic, revengeful way, right? You're just doling out justice as it needs to be done in order to keep society healthy and functioning, right? And so I think that there are these kind of transcendent elements that we're like seeking to understand, and every culture kind of has their own spin on that, right? I think the Eastern cultures are very much focused on more of a like finding the inner like an inner peace and inner enlightenment, whereas Western cultures are very much focused on kind of an enlightenment or a connection with God through exploration of the material world, like pioneering and discovering and aspiring to success and ambition and creation, which I think is is healthy. So but I think the point that he's making there is you're much more likely to find a healthy mode of being if you're looking to the past, right? If you're looking to a theology that was that evolved in tandem with our own culture, with our own people, with our own predilections, with the environments that we lived in, right? Because I think there's symbolism that's attached to religion, but if you live in an area where that symbolism doesn't make sense, right, the religion is not going to make as much sense, right? And that's partially why you go back to those areas and you try to rediscover and kind of capture that experience, what that was like. But I think his point that these gods were called by different names, and it didn't mean that they were different gods. It just meant they were referring to the same thing, right? That to me is very important as a perennialist. We haven't really chatted about this yet in this space. I've had plenty of conversations, and I think anyone who's following my stuff knows this, but as a perennialist, I look at religion as all religions are different frameworks for understanding the same transcendent thing, the divine, right? Some of them get it better than others. Some of them focus on different areas or talk about it in different ways, or whatever the case may be. And I have my own preferences for how I understand that. But I think it's very helpful to think of theology as different frameworks, different languages for describing divinity, and that every strategy for doing so evolves in its own environment. But to that point earlier, that there is this transcendent, and that the point that we'll end on, because I think that you brought it up earlier and it was a good point, is we're looking to the past because the past was what worked, and there's a reason that it like functioned well. It was much more harshly tested because we have a lot of kind of softness in our current environment. But we also need to adapt it to the modern time, right? We can't just go back and kind of what feels kind of like LARP as pagans, right? Or do these rituals that don't really make as much sense to us. It feels much more performative. We don't have as much of a connection. And so I think, to me, that's really the big question that's being addressed here, is the way that we're connecting with divinity right now in the mainstream feels very hollow. It feels very disconnected. It doesn't feel Gnostically, doesn't have that Gnostic connection. And so we're looking further back for things that are much more in line with our ancestral roots, but those things are also fairly disconnected from us. And so how can we take that transcendent truth, right, the perennial truth that you talked about earlier, and how do we adopt that to the modern time in a way that is earnest and authentic, and can actually give us a healthy appreciation and connection for the divine? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's kind of where I leave it.
Yeah, and I was talking to Tom about this. There's a whole other interview that we recorded that I haven't used anything from yet. I might find some way to use it in the future, but we were talking about like what are the gods, at least in Tom's vision, and kind of diving into what, like, how do perennialists view the gods, and it's like it's different ways to interface, almost like interface, or it's like, because they're not, at least in Tom's conception, they're not really archetypes. They're not really quite the collective unconscious of Jung. There's something else. There's something more. There's something more tangible or more real in a sense than that. But
Sure.
they're this different way that, like, I don't even know. They're like a means, a funnel almost towards whatever this higher understanding is. And Tom explains it better in the interview. But I think, and I've been trying to figure out, like, okay, what's the Christian way of, like, what's the Christian distinction between the perennialist view on one hand and the Christian view on the other? Because some Christians look to other religions and are like, well, they're all just purely deceptions and tricks of the demonic realm and of the devil, and these are, all religions that, they don't. Some Christians don't see any redeeming qualities in that. I tend to take a different approach, and it's one that, and again, you even see this in the age of conversion back, around from like 600 AD to like 1200 AD, when different Christians had different views of like what the gods were and like how to interact and interface with paganism. And I think that the healthier understanding is across different religions. I talk about this. I quote from some passages where C.S. Lewis talks about this. The Christian view that I think makes it distinct from the perennialist view is the Christian would say, or at least some Christians would say, such as myself, across different religions, and this is even within some of various popes have written on this as well, but across different religions, like, some of them are more true than others.
Sure.
Some of them are pointing to truth more. Like, if you were to go to Aztec civilization and you have mass human sacrifice and sacrifice of children, if you were to go to Carthage, you were to see, like, again, children being sacrificed. And like it's like some civilizations, their gods are clearly much more what we would think of as like demonic than others. And but you look at other traditions too, not other religions, and like, when I look at a lot of Norse tales, Norse mythology, stories of some of the gods and the heroes, I see much more admirable traits. I see, look at Irish mythology as well. You see much more heroic qualities. You see elements of self-sacrifice, of death and birth and renewal. You see stories of like sacrifice to save others, willingness to have courage and confront monsters. And it's like there are very admirable traits there. And what a Christian like myself would say is that, I guess the perennialists would say all these are kind of different ways of interfacing with the divine, whereas I would say the Christian approach is more like all of the best elements of other religions are pointing to Christ, and they're pointing to the nature of God. And so the best elements of those are directing people in some way that's hard to understand. And how that relates to salvation is kind of a more complicated question, but I think that would be the way to explain the difference.
Yeah,
I'm going all Jordan.
No, I'm right there with you, right? Like, I've had conversations with plenty of Christians on this topic before, and I think that the idea, I used to play around with the idea of a meta religion, right? And basically just found out that that's just perennialism, and I think one of the downsides of using the coin perennialist to kind of talk about myself is that I think people feel like it has kind of a fluffy connotation of like all religions are just the same interpretations of the same thing and equally valid. And I definitely do not agree with the equally valid part, right? To me, it's like, okay, I could look at a situation, I could see like a bunch of people interacting, and I can get a wrong interpretation of that. I still express what I'm visually seeing or what I'm hearing, right? But I might not understand the deeper aspects of that thing. And so I guess that's what when I think of different interpretations of the same thing. I think we're all, they're all looking at the divine, at the spiritual. Do they understand how it really works and how it relates, and how things move and connect, and what morality is, and how to orient yourself? Like, one, kind of going back to my point earlier, different cultures have different environments, they have different intentions, and that will influence the way that framework is built. Because any good language, anytime any good communication takes into consideration the listener, right? You're not just speaking out into the void. You're trying to make an argument to someone, and you have to speak kind of the language that they use. We talked about memes earlier, right? It's the same idea. It's like, if we have shared memes that I can reference, and I can use that to elicit a much higher fidelity understanding, right? I should use those memes, right? But depending on the audience, like, I'll know different memes to use. Like, if I run into someone who also used to row, I can use rowing analogies, right? Or, if I and that's the thing, is like, if you're a Christian, you have this shared language of the Bible and Christianity, and you can talk about the more nuanced things, and you can talk about the stories, and I think that there's huge amount of power in that, right? And this is why I consider myself culturally Christian, is I do believe that the Christian religion, when it's correctly interpreted, is very well kind of aligned with what the true framework for understanding divinity is. I think the problem that a lot of people have, and the reason they're looking towards neo-paganism, is kind of to the point you made earlier. If Christianity is this kind of like meta construction or meta assimilation of all the more refined and more accurate interpretations of the way you have a relationship with the divine, that's slid back, right? That, the mainstream version of that, right? The commercialized, church down the street that has the rainbow flag flying outside, right? They don't really understand the deeper thing, right? Like, they're not doing a great job of talking about, like, turn the other cheek is like a perfect example they get used all the time when people are having this discussion. It's like, you don't just like roll over and take it, right? There is a kind of a balance between, standing up for yourself, having, righteous justice, not allowing, the tolerance of evil is itself an evil, right? It's an abdication of responsibility. And so I think that is the main frustration that people have is, hey, Christianity has all this good in it, but it's been co-opted to kind of push these bad ideas. And is the path, and this is in my mind, is the path to, for these people to just kind of move into paganism, right? And try to recreate something there. Or, maybe we should have a group who are trying to create like a neo-Christianity, right? To move Christian. And that, I know that like some Christians would consider that blasphemous, right?
Well,
or crazy or whatever.
There
right?
have been, I think, there has certainly been traditions of reform and breakaway movements, and so far, there is a long history of that within Christianity. I think that will ruffle the feather of Catholics and Orthodox a lot more than various
Sure,
Protestants. The Protestants would be like, oh yeah, like Calvin or Luther, like, yeah, of course, yeah.
Mm.
But even within Catholicism, there's been, I don't want to discount that there have been major reforms within Catholicism as well internally. But anyway, now I'm gonna get everyone. Now I'm gonna get everyone after me, not just the pagans, but also the Catholics and the.
Yeah, this is my problem that I've noticed as a perennialist, is like, I don't have friends in either camp for the most part. If they are like interpreting what I'm saying in a very like surface level, they just kind of see this like friend enemy distinction clicks in their head.
Right.
Whereas, for me, what I'm trying to do is say, hey, look, like, I believe both sides are oriented towards, the good, broadly defined.
Certainly relative to much of like mainstream culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so to me, it's kind of like, well, we have bigger problems, bigger fish to fry, so to speak, than to argue like the nuance of the interpretation of, how do you have that? What is the correct relationship to have with the divine? Like, again, part of what I've tried to do anytime I tackle kind of theology is to say, hey, look, here are transcendent values when it comes to morality, or when it comes to how you orient your life, that I think should be universally understood and appreciated. And as long as you're kind of on that path, that that's why, the more of my branding, as I've talked about my content, it's like fraternal networking, community, and family, right? Care about, the people around you, try to do good, try to build things up. It's a long, slow process, right? It's not as glamorous. And that's, I think, the next clip that we want to talk about a little bit here, right? But, to me, those are transcendent things that that we all agree on, Christian, pagan, right? Like if you get down to what is really the goal of this, right? In my mind, part of the reason that we have philosophy or ideology or theology is because as individuals, it would be very, very difficult to, like, from scratch, build a new system of values and goals and frameworks for understanding, stories for talking about it. And so, because most people in their lives, it's like, go enjoy your life, go, like, do your work, raise your family, be a good member of your community. You don't have to, like, get into the nuance. But I think we're in this weird spot where, again, we become disconnected. It's an echo of an echo of an echo. How do we rebuild that Gnostic understanding? And so I think that is the main emphasis for the question. The reason that we're having these discussions these days is because people feel too disconnected. They want to recapture that.
And by Gnostic understanding, I assume you don't mean like the demiurge and all that.
No. So when I think of Gnosticism or like a Gnostic understanding, to me that's like a direct knowledge, right? I don't know if you've ever had like an experience where you're like, I feel a connection with divinity, right? In this moment, right? It could be like a flow state, or you're standing on top of the mountain, you're like looking out, right? And you just can like absorb the grandeur of the moment that you're experiencing, right? And you're like, it's the magic of the everyday that I think that we in this technological age, we've lost, right? That appreciation for, hey, I can communicate things through sound vibrations and like, and then we can create life and we can see that rise. And there's these beautiful complex systems and ecosystems and all this, like, to me, like, we're kind of,
you see kind of there's almost like a tear or there's like a kind of, the curtain is rolled back a little bit and you start to see like the kind of the heaven behind, glimpses of heaven, or the light kind of shines through the image, or the fog lifts for a little bit and you see like, oh, so this is actually beyond the kind of mundane world that we're used to. And I think that's something I tried to touch on, is like, it's very hard to see that if you're spending your whole day and all of your life commuting to a 9-to-5 and sitting in a cubicle all day and living in like ugly squalor, it's harder to see the curtain lift.
Yeah.
So I think the way you design even like a city, or the where you travel to or where you spend your time, that affects your ability to have this like revealed knowledge in that sense. Yeah. I mean, would you agree?
So this clip, I think, talks about this concept that we're getting at here, which is, how do we kind of live in the modern day, right? And I think he does a good job of I think it's Tom who's talking. He does a good job of, Tom and you who are talking, and you do a good job of saying, like, look, the problems that we're dealing with are transcendent, right? And then there's some value to kind of rediscovering this. So I think.
Yeah, I know I'm talking to Ian in this clip. I know Ian's talking about more like the living in your day-to-day. How do you translate these sort of great archetypal stories, about how do you live that out in a more day-to-day way?
Yeah,
is that the clip?
And I think I'm pretty sure this is the right one. We'll give it a shot. And then I think the other thing too is I picked this point because you have this beautiful bit with like the hawk, and I just wanted to kind of illustrate just the awesome cinematography that you got going on in the documentary as well.
Cool. Well, I'll play it, and we can always play more if we need to move it to a different spot.
Don't succeed.
We're still, in many ways, the same people that we were 100 years ago, 2,000 years ago. But it's kind of like if you're in a stage play and you're supposed to enact Henry V, but instead of having bows and arrows, your costume has changed and you're in like sweatpants. Instead of a sword, you're given like a
Glock 19.
Glock 19. You replace the trees with some concrete building, and with a Office Max. It's like we're still the same. Like we're still human in the same way, but like our relationship. I think someone used the phrase it's like actor arena relationship. So it's like how do we take ourselves seriously when even though we're made of the same stuff as our ancestors who fit very naturally into these sorts of stories, all of our settings, our costumes have changed. So now we live in this world that like feels very artificial and fake and like unserious.
So you don't have to be fighting in great battles or, allegorically defeating a dragon. But, the mountain is you. You are going to surmount something great, and you don't have to be literally becoming, a man amongst men or becoming the renowned name of the age. You can be doing something that's amazing, even in the mundane that's in your own life. And that's what I think, in a way, many people have to take from this literature. And also they have to recognize their connection to the literature and the stories and how they're a physical embodiment of these ancestors, these thousands of voices. And that voice of your ancestor speaks every day.
Yeah, I mean, look at that shot.
Yeah, this was actually right next to our cabin that we were staying in for that week, just like down the road. It was this is the most beautiful place I've ever been in on Earth. And in Iceland the weather was really rough. This was out in Norway here, and the time we were in Norway, we were so blessed to have just amazing weather conditions. Like Iceland was like trying to kill us. It was like, get off our island. The winds are like blowing. It's like the worst weather in the year. And then we come to Norway. It's like, oh, welcome home. So yeah, it was fun. It was really an experience of a lifetime.
Yeah, but I think the point that that you're both making in that clip is very well taken, which is, there are all of these like the surface level details have changed, right? The costumes have changed, kind of the style of the environment has changed, but the functionality is all the same, right? And the relationships are pretty much the same. And so the question is, how do you take that old knowledge, that old way of being, and how do you maintain that in the current day?
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious what you think are solutions, because I think that it's probably always been a challenge. If you're a peasant living on the farm 1,000 years ago, I'm sure it was the odds of you becoming a knight are quite slim. You're probably gonna have to be landed aristocracy to do that. So the path to embody this kind of epic or archetypal way of living that does tap into the desire of what it is to be a man who wants to, I guess, live in a more heroic or noble way. That's always been hard, but I think aesthetically, I think maybe that's the challenge. I think a lot of it feels like whether it's our architecture or our clothing or our technology, a lot of it does feel at odds with our environment. And it feels like it's, I think, a good indication for what I think makes something good architecture, for instance, is if you add this, let's say you have a landscape. If you add the structure to the landscape, does it enhance it? Like if you put a beautiful castle on this hill, it might actually enhance the landscape and enhance the view. And you're like, wow, this is so cool. If you put Walmart on that hill, it might actually be like you've destroyed this beautiful landscape in this world. And then also if you're in an environment, let's say if you're just walking down the street and there's a massive, beautiful cathedral by you, and you're walking down, and assuming you're wearing clothes that kind of fit, just everyday clothes that kind of fit the environment that are nice enough, it's like that cathedral, it's like its aura goes to you. Your aura farming by being next to the cathedral. It is in some sense, it's like shedding this quality to you that's you can't measure it scientifically. You can't prove it. It's not like a mathematical thing, but there's some sort of spiritual dimension whereby being in the presence of this greater beautiful thing
Mm.
is actually enhancing you and your presence there. And like that's why
Mm.
people take pictures near cathedrals and great works of art. It's
Yeah.
like, because that actually is shedding something on you. It's like imbuing you with some higher noble quality. Whereas if you're standing again by a parking garage, by a strip club, by 7-Eleven, this is actually like, unless you find a way to do it where you're just going for something super grunge and you like, generally though, it's like it's lowering you. It's actually like
Mm.
draining your aura. You are aura minimizing. You are, you're having, it's basically diminishing you and your value by being even in the presence of this like terrible construction.
Mhm.
So I think that's the challenge. And I think, certainly how we dress plays a role in that. But again, if you dress too formally, you're like, well, I'm going to go back to what it's like in the 1960s and 1920s. I'm going to dress in a suit and tie all day. It's like you're going to look like a dork because it doesn't match. You're wearing the wrong costume for the environment.
Yeah.
So, it's a very kind of complex thing, but I think a lot of it comes down to, and Tom talks about this too, with like ornamentation. It's like, it's subtle things too. I think just, I think it's a lot of small decisions that add up to making this dynamic work. But right now it's like there's this friction that we feel, and this is, again, comes down to the aesthetic side of it, where I think we do need to really start evaluating just how significant art is in the way that we live our lives, the way we view ourselves. Because I don't think, and I make this comment, something about taking yourself seriously, and that's not to be like grim or prideful about it, but it's to say,
sure,
it's hard to think in ways that are higher about your civilization and your time and your era when you are basically just like living in squalor aesthetically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's tough, right? Because people will like look at stuff like this and they'll be like, oh, you're just LARPing, right? You're just going on this trip and you're wearing your like really nice camping stuff and you've got all your film equipment, and like, how tough is really your life? Like, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, look, like, we live in this age, right?
Yeah.
We have to react to the context in which we live. And, to me, I've had people level, criticisms of me, like, oh, you have main character syndrome. You're actually like, you think you're going to go out and, try to encourage people to change or lead anything in a positive direction. Like, you're egotistical and delusional and it's all this kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, look, I understand that criticism, but also at the same time, like, everything is going to feel forced or weird to people when it's first happening and when they don't really understand it and all this kind of stuff. And I don't think you want other people's criticisms for your earnest kind of aspiration to understand and to discover and relearn and figure these things out to get in the way of you doing that, right? And that's what I think I really appreciate. Like, I've got a friend who lives further out on the West Coast. I've had him on the podcast before. Great guy, does a lot of, he'll go hiking and, it definitely, like, and I've gone camping plenty of times over on the East Coast, and, I grew up being a Boy Scout and stuff like that. And like, yeah, there is kind of a glamping element sometimes to these things where, you have the really nice shoes and the, the warm weather gear and all of this kind of stuff. But, that's just kind of how you have to do it in the modern age. Right. And I think that, I think that is the challenge that's laid at our feet today, is we are trying to rediscover, how do you have that transcendent connection? And especially when you have this kind of godlike technology, and then you also have this like primordial natural connection with divinity, and trying to rectify those two things all at the same time that, technology is, as your point, creating these soulless, architecture or elements. And so I think that I have a great appreciation for you and Tom and all the other guys who are trying to figure this out, because it's never going to be perfect. There's always going to be ways to criticize it and to diminish it or whatever, right? But at the same time, what's the alternative, right? There's so many people who aren't doing anything, who aren't going out, who aren't being earnest in their exploration. And I think that instead of kind of dismissing those attempts, I think more people should, try to do this for themselves. And I'll kind of end on the point that, and again, going back to this clip, it's about, hey, it doesn't have to be a grand journey. It doesn't have to be that you're changing the world or whatever it is. It can simply be, this is your own story. This is your own exploration, and it's meaningful to you, and it's meaningful to, the small corner of the world that you occupy and can influence. And I think that, that's tough for a lot of people who live in a digital age of influencers and all of these kinds of things. So they feel like everything has to be grand and ridiculous and over the top, or, you just might as well just stay at home and, sit in front of your computer or whatever it is. And I have a lot of appreciation for that message, because I think that it's a very important one. And I do see that it is growing, this kind of call to, local, individual excellence, fraternal, community, family focused, ambition, aspiration.
Yeah. And I do think, we have to go beyond based and cringe. We have to, I think there's a degree to which any amount of authenticity does have an element of cringe to it. And I think you just have to say, yeah, I'm going to accept, I'll be a little cringe if I need to. That's the price of being more authentic. And, I think that also comes down to when you make something, it's not supposed to be for everyone. If it's for everyone, it's just mass market. Like if everyone likes it, it's probably trash. So I kind of hope for, I've gotten kind of a polarized result. I mean, generally very positive feedback, but certainly get some people up in arms, which I think is probably a good thing. Because if everyone resonated with it, like I don't think that'd even be possible, or it'd just be mass market slop. So, and I'm not saying it's like a masterwork by any means. It's a YouTube video. So, but and that is the thing I'm trying to figure out too. And I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this. It's like, this was an experiment to see, can I try to make something that's relatively, at least relative to the budget, something that's relatively high quality and engaging, that gets people thinking, that kind of elevates the quality of the discourse. I don't know. I think it's just going to go back to people like throwing mud at each other on Twitter, probably. But maybe it'll spark some interest in other people to have more conversations or to do cool projects. But I do also hope, I'm really passionate about media, creating, documentaries. I would love to do more in the film space, although that's not really a world I'm very connected to. And I don't have any rich producer uncles or anything. So, but I would like to see, it's like, can we continue to kind of up this? Like, is there a space for this kind of media? And it's a challenge too, because, I'm just a small channel. I'm doing it backwards in some ways, because really, if you want to do it in a way that makes sense financially, you would grow the channel through doing a lot of like podcasts and clips, and I would be doing that because it's way better relative to the time, and people, just even posting like what I made as a documentary just as an interview, like not as a documentary, just as purely an interview, and it's kind of a hybrid between an interview and a documentary. But if I was to just do an interview, probably would get similar amount of views, like maybe 80% as many views or something, for way less work. Or just doing, if I did, and I think live streams are kind of the future, and like they're awesome. I love doing them, but they make way more sense in terms of the time that goes into them relative to how much people are willing to engage. So it would be smart. And that's the other thing too. It's like, do the people out there like really care that much about something that is visually higher production? I don't know. And I'm kind of trying to figure that out. I felt like with this, I had a sense that God was opening an opportunity to do a really cool project that's kind of like a once in a lifetime thing that, it might have meaning to someone out there, and it may not be a large audience, but generally I feel like the type of audience that I've gotten for a lot of my content, it's been really high quality people, led to great connections, like conversations like what we're having. But it's been niche. But if it's niche for the right people, for people who it matters for, then I think it's worth it.
Yeah.
Again, it doesn't make sense financially, so I'm not really sure if there's ways I can scale it. Like I
Sure.
don't like I make like $4 on Patreon, and it, like the production cost is maybe closer to, not factoring in the gear, just in terms of travel, is probably like $5,000. About 4 months of work to make something like this. So it's like I love doing it. It's great. How often I can do something like this, I might have to just go back to doing other kind of content for a while, and then maybe eventually revisit something at this scale. So I don't know. What do you think is the future of media? Like, do you think there is room for maybe not something of this length, maybe like micro documentaries or micro films or something? Or do you think there is a space for this? Because Hollywood's been dropping the ball, but I'm not sure how to really build up the next media space either.
Sure. No, I think this is a very relevant question because, one of the constant conversations in the online kind of subculture community, right, is, we've got to have our own arts, right? We have to, if we really want to get our ideas out there and get people on the right wavelength, we need to go out there and produce, right? And unfortunately, the vast majority of people who, espouse this idea don't really do anything. And then even if they do something, it's pretty niche and small. And that's, I think, a big part of why, I've been following your stuff so much is, to me, you are genuinely taking action, right? This idea, I had a conversation with somebody about this a while back, but it was, they were making the point that, all of these people kind of espouse to reading all these books, like, I read all these books, I have all this knowledge. And it's like, well, knowledge is useless without implementation, right? If you aren't actually doing something with that knowledge and wisdom, then what was the point, right? And I think that what's great about this documentary is you are taking the first steps, right? You're exploring this, you're kind of seeing the viability of it. To your point about the audience being relatively small, it's kind of a similar situation with my content, right? Like I've always kind of given this advice to people when they're first starting out, and they're like, should I start a Substack, or should I start writing articles or making videos or whatever it is? And I tell them, definitely. Right? Because at the very least, the experience of creation in itself has value. You're going to explore these ideas for yourself. You're going to learn. I'm sure the trip is something that, regardless of how good the video does, you will always remember and have that. And, but on top of that, whatever you put out, if it's authentically what you care about and what you're interested in and represents kind of, who you are and what you're, about, the people you connect with through that medium, through that content, are, to your point, going to be very much in that wavelength, on that alignment. And I've had the same experience with my content. Is, the vast majority of the people who I meet, who are interested in my stuff, they get that I'm trying to kind of extract myself from this, kind of low quality, clickbaity, rage baity, frustration, problem, just constantly focusing on the problems and not talking about what are the solutions, and specifically solutions that do require unglamorous work, local action, personal excellence, fraternity business, all that kind of stuff. It's not the LARPy kind of barbarian power fantasy stuff that often gets sold, partially because that's appealing. Right. Yeah. It's like the pornography, the intellectual pornography of people who are disillusioned. Right. They want a power fantasy. They want to think that they're special and cool without actually having to do the work. Right. And I think that more people are starting to realize that's a non-viable path. Right. That's kind of keeping them in this kind of immature, loop that's never going to progress anywhere. And so, we're moving forward in that direction. But to finally answer your question, I know there's like kind of a lot of build up here, to answer your question about like where this goes. And, I personally think that the higher quality stuff that you're putting out, what I would hope that would happen is that the people who this resonates with, that have like the attention span that isn't 30 seconds because they've been watching brain slop, like TikTok videos all the time. And they can look at something like this and they can say, I appreciate that somebody, took the time to create this, to articulate these arguments, to put this together, and especially in an aesthetic that is pleasing, right? I've referenced a few times that I think the quality of the cinematography in the documentary is really high, despite, tripod issues and all the stuff that you talked about.
Thank you. Yeah. It's not, it's not my ideal scenario, but
yeah. And I think that the hope there is very similar to the fact that, like, you have people who buy IKEA furniture, right? And it's just like, maybe that's what they can afford or it's easy. But you also have the people who have the appreciation for handcrafted stuff, and supporting artists that they think are doing really good work. And so my hope would be, as this kind of more, maybe you call it mature culture of, hey, we got to take practical action. We have to appreciate virtue and an aspiration for higher quality art and stuff like that. Not just, barbarian LARPing online. There will be more of a patronage network. I mean, the good old boys, Bog Beef, Marbeck, they talk all the time about this of like, hey, if we want to see things succeed, we have to patronize them. And that's part of the reason that why I encourage like personal excellence and, building these fraternal networks in business, is because hopefully then our guys are making money, and then they can, give that money to, guys like yourself who are doing things that then, have a broader reach and kind of send out that message and that wavelength. So to kind of conclude this answer that I'm throwing at you is, I have a great appreciation for the aesthetic that you're cultivating. I think that there is absolutely a market for it. I think that it sets a standard that more people should aspire to. And I think the correct response is, how do we get people to support more stuff like this? And I think the thing for me that I've always talked about with content creation in the modern age is it can't just be about the content. It also has to be, you have to kind of be a creator who has a little bit of a persona that goes on, that talks about the things, and not like in a egotistical way, but in a way that kind of deepens what you're doing, right? Like I think that hopefully people appreciate that, because I know you're doing this podcast, but you've done other podcasts and you're going on, you're talking about these ideas. And I think that deeper articulation of why you're doing what you're doing and what you're getting at and the goals, and then being part of that discussion in that community, I think that is a huge selling aspect for a lot of people, because again, it speaks to that authenticity. It speaks to this idea that we're kind of collectively trying to evolve a new understanding, a new way of being. There isn't necessarily a right answer that we could just define and go with and push. We're not at this kind of like, corporatized marketing campaign, right? Where it very much has like the crowdsourcing, the discovery of that path.
Yeah.
So all that to say, I really appreciate what you're doing. I think you're on the right wavelength. I hope more people support you. I really think that, in my mind, that's the defining factors. Like, you're doing the right stuff. The question is, how well can you galvanize the community around you and get people to really understand that if we want to see more of this, if we're saying all these, oh, it's great art, yeah, like, people got to put their money where their mouth is. So
yeah, and I don't say that to eBay or anything, because I want to express too, like, people have been supportive. Like, I have a friend, like one of my local friends out in Iceland, put up a lot of money of his own money to help fund the trip and fund a lot of the travel expenses. I probably wouldn't have been able to do it without a lot of his support. So there are some people out there who have been like really generous and have been, and doing things like sharing it around and stuff like that's awesome. So I'm really grateful. And like the reason I'm probably too small to really paywall content anyway, but I wouldn't want to paywall something like this, because the reason I'm making it to begin with is because it's like, it's to cast out into the world and see who resonates with it. And I think, so I think it's kind of a long-term business model question of, is there a way that, because there's like, I'm happy to kind of just keep doing this as passion projects and stuff, and I can sustain it by doing other work that I do, like to make a living, and then try to put some aside to do some of these passion projects. I think the question becomes, I don't know if there's a way to scale it to the point where it's like other people out there doing their own projects or doing things with a crew, Things that are more in depth. So I feel like that's maybe more of an entrepreneurship business model question. Is there a way we can kind of find a way to tap into the market effectively through some sort of business model structure down the road? And that's just something I'm just thinking through.
Sure. I mean, to me, I think that the real quick answer there is just, I'm sure you've heard me go off on the timeline about this. Like, we live in a world of hyper individualism. It's like, oh, you got to figure it out yourself. You got to do it on your own. And that's obviously not true, right? It's the group and the fraternity that gives things like power and viability, right? You talked about the safety net society offers and all this kind of stuff.
As we found out with the Hegseth leaks and some of the other group chats out there, the world is just competing group chats. That's all that finance and power and influence and business is these days.
Sure. And that's my thing, right? Is like, what I hope, in your kind of endeavor to put this out there, it's a beacon, right? And it'll attract people who are kind of on board, that resonate. They see that, they have appreciation for what you're trying to do. And then from that, maybe you meet, more guys who are, working with camera or travel or want to support things like this or whatever. And then it becomes a more cohesive unit, right? And kind of things go from there. And so, I would say that I'm very optimistic, right? As someone who does a lot of networking in our sphere and tries to, find and connect all the good guys. Like, I think that there's a demand for this, and there's people who are in the right space and want to work together. And I like to think that we are kind of pioneering that stuff. Yeah. Main character syndrome, whatever, you got to lay at me, but
well, I think we're early days. I'm talking about this stuff as like, oh, it'd be great to have a whole industry of doing lots of stuff like this. I'm still like a tiny figure, like on the fringe, tiny corners of the internet somewhere. That's way off to the side. So I don't say this with unrealistic expectations of how much can you grow with like a 2,000 something subscriber channel. It's like, well, of course it's small. I haven't posted tons of content or anything, so it's I think we're still early. I think there's still tons of room to grow, and some of this stuff will just take time. But I also want to kind of keep in the back of my mind, like, I think there is huge room for where things could be, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Now that's still a huge untapped space.
Yeah, and I think technology is unlocking that too, right? You got better cameras, easier, to get things around, miking systems, all that kind of stuff. And so the opportunity, and then I think also once you establish yourself in the network, as someone who can put out quality stuff, there's going to be more of a demand. Like, I'm curious. I feel, and again, I think you are on the intellectual vanguard of this very pertinent discussion that, of like neo-paganism and what does this mean, and where is it going, and the characters who are kind of having this conversation. I think that it's one of those things. I've said this before, right? We're kind of seeing the emergence of a new subculture, right? And I think largely, my interpretation is that the old subculture of what we maybe call the dissident right is going mainstream, and they're kind of, it seems like they're compromising what they initially were about in order to kind of better fit that mainstream dynamic. And so there's this void, this new subculture void, and like, what is that going to look like? And how are those different people going to evolve, and how are they going to market their stuff, and how is that going to affect culture? Because I think we've things move both really fast, but also so slow you kind of get used to it. And I think that there's now a lot of ideas that 10 years ago, if you told somebody these are prevalent ideas in the mainstream, they would be super surprised, right? And I think we'll probably see the same thing in the next 10 years.
Yeah, the Overton window is always it's moving in strange ways, kind of unpredictable ways in some sense. But and I also want to give a shout out and a thank you to Tom as well, because I'm a small account out there, and Tom was down to collaborate and try something experimental and do a project. We just kind of figured it out and we made it happen. And so I'm grateful that he was down for an adventure. And so that's something I'm definitely grateful for as well.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just going to throw him on the on the screen here if people are curious and want to go follow Tom.
Yeah, and one thing that doesn't get communicated as well in the documentary from the behind the scenes is how funny Tom can be. Like just some of the banter we had and how much time we got him to do all the regional accents across all of the UK. So that was pretty fun.
Awesome.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I guess my question for you is like, what excites you? Another comment too that's kind of funny is all the footage. I look back at the footage, all the stuff from like the first week on the trip versus like by the third week. I was so much like fatter in the first week. So all the footage, I'm like all puffy and like fat, and then by the end, I'm like lean, slimmed down. From I guess. Oh yeah, and it was also, you know, I'm amazed that some of the stuff turned out as well as it did, considering it was from the initial trip. I had 2 8-hour layovers, and then I also had to wait. Well, I had to wait like another 8 hours once I was in Iceland to get picked up because my friend had to work. I arrived like super early in the morning, and then he had to work all day, and then picked me up after. So I was at the airport all day, and then it was like midnight or something by the time we fell asleep. So I went about 48 hours with no sleep, just starting off getting there, which is probably the longest I've ever been up. So it turned into, and there were a few other, and we got up early a lot of the time to do stuff, and then had some other, for other connecting flights and stuff. We had some super late nights that were pretty crazy. So it turned into the Russian sleep experiment, and I had just the blackest, darkest bags under my eyes, like, for pretty much the whole trip, especially the first week. By the end of the first week and a half, Tom's like, you're starting to look human now. I was like, thank you, Tom. Yes, I'm recovering a bit. So I'm amazed that I didn't come off as completely incoherent, considering how I was just on like no sleep. And I'm amazed that I lost weight, considering I was basically doing all the things you're not supposed to do, which is like drinking, no sleep, eating random stuff, drinking lots of diet soda. That was basically energy, like Monster energy drinks.
Sure.
That was the trip. Yep, in a nutshell.
Yeah, maybe the air is just different out there. You know,
different air. Yep, it's true. It's the North Atlantic.
Yeah. So, you know, I guess to kind of, you know, move us towards wrapping up and everything, I'd be curious, you know, what are your any upcoming projects, any, you know, things to look forward to the future, any of that kind of stuff?
Well, I mean, I have a lot of half-written scripts. I have like in my Google Documents, I have pages and pages of ideas and scripts and things I'd like to do. I think partly I've kind of set an expectation now with the channel. I've raised the bar a bit. So how do I create something that doesn't just totally like all the new people who've come in? They're like, "Where's the next documentary?" I'm like, "Give me like 5 years on that, or give me like a year or something." We'll see how long it takes to do another big project. But I'd like to just kind of do a mix of stuff. Again, it's not for me. It's not really about making this like as an income or something. So I'm happy to experiment. I think it's worth just trying out different types of projects. I love doing the video essays. I love doing live streams and conversations, podcasts. I love doing like the documentary style content, interviews with people. I think it might be fun to try to do more like micro documentaries or micro films with people. Something that's just like kind of like what Lost Gods is, but just super condensed, super short, just a snippet, a taste, maybe an interesting character, an interesting location, telling. Just getting people to think through something. So that'd be something I'd like to experiment with.
Yeah, like maybe like a mini series around like exploring different topics, and then, you know, from that you can see, you know, where the interest is, you know, what people are hungry for. Yeah, because I think one of the big things that I see when I look at like YouTube content creators, and to me, I don't think of them as like YouTube content creators. I just think of, you know, guys who are experimenting with, you know, modern media and how to create like new content, is that the iterative cycle is really helpful, right? It's really helpful to, you know, try new things. And the same thing, I used to do a little bit of like meme videoing
Oh,
like
yeah,
you
yeah.
start to learn like tricks and shortcuts and ways to do things easier. I remember I made like a Warhammer 40K joke meme video, and I like drew like Tyrannid NPCs over like all the Tyrannid guys, and that was like such an arduous process. And at one point I lost my save file, and that was like hours of work on. Yeah. I know everyone knows, everyone cringes collectively when you talk about like the hours of work that didn't get saved and get lost. But by the time you've done it a few times, right, like you get into a system. Same thing with my, with my writing, I kind of have a loop there. And so I think that, those smaller things, that there's a lot of value to kind of exploring your style and approach. But yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed watching that, just because it's very well done. The discussions are interesting, and I think you're hitting on this really key question, which is, how do we make sense of the modern world? How do we extract what was a value of the past and adapt it to the future? I think that's been kind of a key I wrote an article years now ago about the death of the trad wife ideal, and basically how in the conservative kind of zeitgeist there is this idea of like, oh, we just need to rebuild trad women, and barefoot and naked and pregnant in the kitchen or whatever it is, right?
Sundress in the wheat field.
Yeah. And it's just like, well, look, it's not viable, right? Because the modern world is what it is, and you're not going to get people to just flip a switch. They're not going to just jump into your fantasy, right? And so, but there's something to be said for traditional values and like the transcendent roles of men and women in raising a family together, that they are complementary and symbiotic, and kind of leaning into those healthy, natural kind of foundational aspects of who we are is very viable. I mean, it's part of what I wrote with the techno transhumanism article that I came out with recently. That was months in the making, but one of the key points that I make is the counter in my mind to techno transhumanism, or the opposite, the antithesis, isn't being a Luddite, right? It's being what I call a humanist. And I know that I've since learned that term was evidently it's a previously existing term that is kind of a detachment from God, which I can think is so nonsensical that I think that it should not be the definition broadly of that term. To me, what it is an appreciation for what makes us human, kind of our natural foundation, and making sure that as we create more technological advancement, synthetic process, innovation, that is good, right? Like that can make us more powerful in specific dimensions, but we have to understand how that meshes with who we are as humans and how we interact, and kind of the natural systems and way of doing things. Like, for example, like breastfeeding a baby when they're first born is always going to be superior to formula, not simply because the quality of the milk is going to be better, but also the act of breastfeeding is a transcendent act that builds a bond between mother and child, and you can't replace that, and it is such an important, necessary thing. And so you could say that all these natural ways of doing things are superior. The synthetic ways can be better in certain dimensions, but they're if they are to be good and healthy and balance all of these kind of invisible systems, because people might not think, breastfeeding is about, isn't just about nutrition. It's also about facilitating a deeper relationship between mother and child, right? If they don't consider that, that's not a dimension that they're judging the value on, right? They're going to lose that value in the creation of, baby formula or whatever. And so I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do now, is we still have to create synthetic systems. We have to ride that tiger of technological advancement and cultural change, but we need to do so in a way that's viable, that fits and connects to the past. And so to kind of summarize, I think that is kind of the heart of the issue that you're getting at here. And I think that anything that you create kind of along those lines going forward, I think there's going to be a huge demand for.
Well, thank you. No, it's a huge encouragement. I really appreciate that you've been, you reach out to and get in touch with a lot of smaller creators, and you've been very supportive of lots of guys behind the scenes. So I really appreciate that. And I'm curious too, like what is it coming up for you personally, or for your I guess the issues you care about or the projects you have going on, like what would you like to see and like what's exciting you currently?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I think you are literally putting this Lost Gods thing out at like the perfect time, because I do think that the neo-paganism issue is becoming more of an issue. The way I see it in the online conversation that we're having right now, the zeitgeist, is people are realizing that we're probably not going to get a top-down solution. We're not going to get the elites. They kind of have their own priorities and things that they care about. And sometimes that aligns with us, sometimes it doesn't. And at the very least, those people aren't going to like come into your personal life, and they're not going to like fix your personal life. Right. And so the only way that you're going to do that is a bottom up. Right. And this is something I've been advocating for a long time. It's personal excellence and fraternal networking as a foundation for business, community, and family. Right. That's become kind of my condensed, elegant articulation of kind of where my head's at. And I think you're starting to see that realization kind of dawn on the broader zeitgeist. I think they're also becoming a lot less apologetic for dealing with the harsh truths of the world that we live in. Recent fundraising situations, are a good example of this. And the question becomes, okay, now that we're starting to address these problems, what do we do? And again, I think the solution is not, a glamorous solution of, big movements, or, it's not going to be like people holding up flags and, revolutions in the streets or anything like that. I think it is going to be a slow, steady, unglamorous march of, local community building, of fraternal networking, of, cultivating power, right? And, I think that they're one of the sophons, the things that kind of gets in the way of us having this understanding, is this idea that power is bad, right? It's like only evil people aspire to power and wealth.
All power corrupts.
Yeah.
Power inherently corrupts, that sort of thought process.
Yeah, and I vehemently disagree with this, because I think it's an extremely unhealthy sentiment if you're telling people who want to be good earnestly that if they try to aspire to power and wealth and success, they're just going to become corrupted, and there's nothing they can do about that. And so a lot of them are just going to say, hey, if I'm a good guy and I know that aspiring to power is going to corrupt me, then I'm just not going to aspire to power. But and then you create a world where the only people aspiring to power are, evil, egotistical, greedy people who want control.
And taking that premise the other way, like to become more virtuous, if you believe that power inherently corrupts and is this corrupting force, then you should actually become the most like weak and defenseless bug man that you can possibly be.
Yeah. And so I think what I like to think that realization is starting to dawn on people, that there is a calling for people who, are virtuous and aspire to these higher things to aspire to power and, wealth and success, not for self-enrichment, but out of a sense of noblesse oblige, right? Out of stewardship and, an understanding that no one else is going to solve these problems. They have to be proactive. And so this practical discussion of how that is achieved, how people go after that. And that's kind of been a large focus of mine, is this parallel network building, these parallel systems, right? Guys like yourself who can go out and create documentaries and not have to, please, patronage networks of people who are going to want you to, have a very specific message that that is aligned with, what they're trying to, the zeitgeist and the way that they're trying to influence it. And so I think that the bottom up solution and the cultivation of, power through fraternal networks and competence and business building, that is going to be essential to a success. And I don't think it's necessarily the end goal isn't to make the world perfect, right? I don't think that's practical or necessarily achievable. I think what is going to happen is understanding that we're basically breaking into a kind of diamond age-esque, you kind of like these files, these different groups that are, centered around different ideologies, and they might be geographically dispersed, right? But They have their own like geographical little footholds, but they are ideologically united in what they're trying to achieve. And I think that's basically what we're doing, with what's happening in the subculture space. Is you have this range of different strategy of philosophy of approach, whether it's neo-pagan or neo or like a kind of Christian, or you have people who are a little bit more, they're not so the main selling point of their ideology is not the religious aspect, but like preparedness or whatever it is. You have different flavors and different people, and I don't necessarily agree with all of them, but they're all broadly oriented towards seeing the problems in the mainstream and creating some sort of alternative environment. And I think that much like a startup, you have to provide something that has a lot of value for people to make the switch to adopt it. And early on, it is this LARPy dream of kind of like, it feels kind of cringe and all that kind of stuff. But I think there is quickly going to become a turning point where people realize, no, this is viable, this is healthy, this is positive. The thing I'll cap it off on is, I try to put out content where I can show it to my neighbors, right? Or the other people that I, kind of meet. I do, search and rescue and a bunch of other stuff, right? And what I want to be able to do is those people who are involved in their community, who are volunteering, who care about family, like I can send them the content and it resonates with them because they're like, yeah, like the solution isn't getting caught up in this national political discussion and fighting each other with and dunking as you're this kind of low quality conversation online. It's encouraging people to log off and be part of their community. And I think that the value of the digital space is ideas, and they should be high quality ideas, and then the opportunity to network with other men. Because I think one of the difficult things for us as men is, as we're figuring this out, it's not like you can talk to your therapist or that you should have a therapist, or you really shouldn't be dumping these concerns or problems on your woman. That's not healthy for her, right? Like women are really good at reflecting back the energy that you give them. And if you're like, worrying about like the future and whatnot, like that's not a healthy thing to put on them. And so you have to find other men, right? And that can be difficult to find them in your local community to kind of speak at the level that, a lot of us go through. And so if we can find these online fraternal networks where we can have these discussions, we can kind of come to the healthy, positive conclusions of like, okay, I've had my digital journey, and I now understand that despite all the craziness, the thing that matters is I should go to my community and be an active member and, try to aspire to virtue and be upstanding and raise a good family. Right. So, it is very much the hero's journey of you return to the village forever changed. And then it's kind of the part two of, okay, well, then you apply that knowledge, right? That implementation that we talked about earlier. And I think that's what the fraternal network is for. It's to help people kind of orient themselves, to realize the values, to go out into the community to do that. And then if there's a need for support or assistance or collaboration or, crowdsourcing information, that's what that online network is. But the next step is this kind of parallel network building and this parallel system building. And it has to start local.
Yeah. Because I think really it's like what people are really needing or looking for that isn't being addressed by establishment institutions, by the current structure of power. It's a sense of belonging, a sense of local community, knowing people, being embedded in meaningful friendships and relationships, having people who you are comfortable and think it's a good thing that like, well, I want to live in this place and be around people where I want my children eventually to be able to marry their children, and it becomes kind of like extended family that way. This sort of patriarchal way of kind of patriarch mindset, like you would picture from like the Old Testament or something, or a chieftain, how a jarl would think. And it's the psychology. It's how do we get out of this sort of self-destructive psychology, so we're not just trapped in like guilt and self-destruction, and so we can have this place of it's just really a more cohesive way of like, how can we live in a way that's spiritually and psychologically healthy in a like communal, not communal in the sense of like living in a commune, but in like not a individual bubble sort of way.
Sure. And I
So,
think
yeah,
your
I
point
think,
is well taken, that the spiritual aspect is a big part of that, right? Like it's very hard, because I think part of this is, in order to make this change, we kind of have to give ourselves permission to do that, because no one else is out there saying like, go do this thing, right? It's not a commonly encouraged ambition for out there. And so you almost have to give yourself that permission. And where do you derive that authority? Well, you kind of have to derive it from the divine, from God, right?
Yeah.
Like it is kind of like I am trying to do something that is good. And I think, especially if you're not getting that immediate satisfaction, which is so prevalent in today's society, right? You have to kind of have a different value system, a value system that isn't materialistic. And so an appreciation for the spiritual, for God, for these higher transcendent things. To me, that is like the single most powerful motivating factor that anyone can have. And so I think that if this movement is to be successful, it can't be materialistic. It needs to have an appreciation for divinity. And that's why I think this conversation is being had, and what is such a big thing in the zeitgeist is, we want that change. We want to like get away from the materialistic, degenerate, virtueless, mainstream delusion. And we want to aspire to something better, but to the energy that's going to run on is kind of a religious, a spiritual, a transcendent energy. And so that having that relationship and figuring out what that is such an important question for people to figure out right now.
Yeah, and I know you have to get going. I guess the last point too, I'm trying to figure out, and this documentary was kind of an experiment in this, but like when you spend enough time on the internet, or when you're curious and you're exploring the world, and if you have a certain amount of intellectual courage, like you said, you realize there are a lot of things about the world that are truths that are like hard truths or uncomfortable. How do you take that? I think there's a real question to be figured out in how do you, like, a lot of the ways you find this is only online, or you learn things about the world. Like, how do you take those ideas and actually make them practical? Like, how do you kind of, because you have to go into places where it's like, when people learn things about the world that it'll make them like angry or uncomfortable, or like, how do you come out of that without being like a spurg online, or how do you take that in a way that's like still I don't know if respectable would be the term, but like, what's the mature way to go and take things that are controversial or touch on culture war issues, things that are serious and do get people's hackles up, but to present that, or take elements of that in a mature way and say, okay, we'll deal with things that are like, we'll deal with truth and reality, but we won't, like, we'll present it in a way that's actually constructive and not just a flame war.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out, like,
yeah, well,
it's a complicated question, but
I love this question, because I think that it is kind of a very, because again, I use this concept of immature and mature a lot as I'm kind of describing more and more kind of the on the spectrum of like barbarian LARPing power fantasy versus kind of like the mature side, which is this sense of responsibility and local community action and stuff like that. And the question is, how do you get guys there, right? And I talked a little bit about when part of the value of the online fraternal networks and the discussion that happens online is, as people are exploring and rejecting the mainstream, they're looking for some way of kind of wrapping your head around what's happening. And I think that a big part of that is people want to be understood. They want to feel like they're not crazy. Like back in 2016, when I started going through kind of figuring some stuff out, like, you start having conversations with people and you're like, oh, you don't see what I'm seeing. And because I'm talking about this, like, you're having a really aggressive, like, you're crazy kind of reaction, but I don't feel, so either I'm crazy or the people around me are really deluded. And like, it's not like a good dilemma to feel yourself in the middle of, right? And so I think the value of the online conversations that you have is to kind of just, it's to vent, it's to process, it's to get it out of your system. It's to realize that, like, yes, you're not crazy. Like, there are problems with the world. There's a lot of these harsh truths that people just don't talk about. And, once you get that out of your system, then you don't have to like spurg out, so to speak, with the people around you. And that's kind of been a lot of what I encourage people to do, is realize you can have a conversation about what's important in the context of these virtues, right? In the context of personal excellence, of community building, of fraternity, of family, and everything can kind of be an appeal to that. And that is such a fundamental part of who we are as human beings, that we appreciate, people who are willing to, do good things for their community, who care about their family, who want to, see themselves and others be successful. That it's really, really hard that if you're expressing things through that frame, that one, people are going to understand it, right? Even the normie, so to speak, is going to understand, hey, I care about family, I care about community. And it's going to be very hard for them to push back if that's the context in which you're having that conversation, right? If you're saying, I want a safer community, and so I want us to, punish criminals who, act out, right? Like, it's really, really hard to come up with a counter argument to that point, right? And I think like that's the thing is you have this edgy branding, this edgy aesthetic that is very prevalent online, and people really buy into like, oh, this is my new identity. And that's part of the problem is we don't have these healthy role models to look up to. We don't have these higher values. Again, it's part of the reason that, people are aspiring to this kind of neo-paganism is they want something to kind of be their North Star of what should I be doing? What does give me value? And especially in a world that just feels so valueless, right? It's everything value subjective, morals are subjective, right? Like there's no truth is kind of the, what we're constantly told in the mainstream. And so how do you navigate something like that? Especially when indulging in vice and all of these things is so inherently unfulfilling, right? It's that chasing of the dragon. And so, to me, I think that is really what I try to provide in, with my content is to tell people, hey, look, like, yeah, you're not crazy. Things are weird and messed up and people kind of ignore the harsh truths of reality, but there is an objective truth to not only how things work, but how things, I always say this, it's not just the is, but the oughts, right? Because there's this common misconception, I think, that, you can't determine oughts. No one can say what you ought to do. And I'm like, no, that's just wrong, right? Like anytime you have a game that has a clear goal and it has fundamental rules, there are optimal strategies. And that's kind of how I see life. The goal of life, most simply defined, is to flourish. It's the perpetuation of healthy patterns over time, especially over longer periods of time. And so things like community and family and raising kids right and instilling them with good values and teaching them, how the world works and how to cooperate and work together. These are very, positive, flourishing patterns that you can perpetuate. And so you should be oriented towards that, right? And, we have rules of reality, how things work. And so there are optimal strategies and there are oughts that are out there. And so you can give people direction and value. It's going to be different contextually, both in the time that we live in, but also in the, the individual situations that everyone else has. But to me, I think it kind of goes back to what we were saying in the beginning with, not everyone can build a theology from the ground up or a philosophy from the ground up. And so the more that we can kind of crowdsource a meta definition of the direction that we're going here, the easier it is for people to say, yeah, that makes sense. And I'm going to get on board. And now I don't have to worry about, is community something that's important? I can just go out and focus on my community. And, my hope is that, hey, if I'm right, that community is important. It's fulfilling to do those things. And that's going to give you a meaningful life. And that's going to build that flourishing over time. And, so that's kind of my hope with a lot of this stuff, is to give people, to share a lot of the stuff that I wish I had known earlier on, that people, I would have been great to hear, back in 2016 when I was like trying to figure it all out. And then say, hey, look, like we have to be the kind of like cringe early adopters who are, fake it till you make it, kind of like, trying to build these things out, because, again, no one from the top down is going to do it. It has to come from the bottom up.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah. And that's one thing I appreciate about the aesthetics you use as well. Even the background on this stream, like you're putting a vision for people to aspire towards. You're putting a certain level of optimism in there. It's like, and it's kind of a cool, ways of incorporating technology in a way that's cool and exciting and not detrimental. And it's great because it's what your vision is for the future, what you look towards. And I think that's why the visual dimension of creating content, creating media is important is because, yeah, that's the vision you have in your subconscious. Are you aspiring to post-apocalyptic warband leader ruling over your little pirate clan,
Yeah.
or or are you aspiring to something that is more for like flourishing and something optimistic, something that really excites you, that has real potential? And I think that's a much stronger vision to have. So I
Yeah.
appreciate that. I think
I think people
it's
get
inspiring to
caught
me.
up. They get caught up in like, oh, any solution needs to be grand. It needs to be, a big revolution or something like that. It's like, no, exactly the second clip that we played, right? It's about what you do in your day to day. And, I think that to kind of tie this in with the broader concept of this revitalization of spirituality and kind of the magic of the everyday, is realizing, and this is kind of the big frustration that I have with the Stoics, where they're like, oh, nothing matters. And if you zoom out, like you're just a dust or whatever. It's like, your life is the most important thing. Like you should take it deadly seriously and also not seriously at all. Right. Like you can't interpret bad, setbacks or challenges or difficulties as like the world blowing up or God not liking you or whatever it is. Right. Like you see those as healthy challenges, and your success isn't measured by like how much money you've accumulated at the end. Right. It's like, did you tell a good story? Right. Like, is your story, like if someone wrote it in a book, are you going to be proud that other people are reading it? Like, did you make, when the decisions that were important to you in your life came, did you make the right decision? Not in like the one that was going to enrich you the most, but the one that was going to make people say like, that's a character that I honor, right? Like I appreciate what they're doing. Right. And so to me, like that understanding of the opportunity that we've been given, kind of the magic of this time, right? This chance to build and to do interesting things, right? Like that meme that you hear all the time, you could just do things, right? Like, it's kind of a LARP, but it's also kind of true. Like
that meme kept going through my head when I was thinking about the documentary and I'm like, this doesn't make sense, but I gotta do something. I'm like, oh, you could just make a documentary. That's cool.
Yeah, well, I'm excited. Hopefully many more to come. I like the idea of like a mini series or smaller stuff. And I think there's a lot of interesting characters. I wasn't aware of Tom until you put this out there.
Oh, okay.
But
Cool.
there's a lot of other interesting characters that I'm sure that hopefully we'll get to see you make the rounds and chat with.
Thank you. Yeah, well, and thanks for having me on again. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. I'm excited I talked a lot. I rambled a lot in this, so I'm excited. Maybe next time I can interview you and ask you a bunch of questions too.
No, I think we had a good back and forth. I think we, it's great too, because like a lot of times when I wrap up a podcast, I'm always kind of like, did I touch on all the ideas that I wanted to touch on, and we discuss the subjects? And I think we hit a lot of really good ones here. I hope more people go and check out the documentary if you haven't already. It's fantastic. Where can people support you, right? Like what's the best way? Like follow you on X, what else?
Yeah. I have on my website, NorthHugr.com. I also have it on my X bio and all my social media platforms. I have all my links, just NorthHugr.com/links. Yeah, you can find all my pages there. Trying to build out the website, seeing if there are interesting things I can do with the website. So I just launched that this last week. That has like a gallery, and I'll be putting up some blog posts on there and stuff too. But yeah, that's where you can find me. And yeah, that's it. That's the website. So just I like the aesthetic I was going with there. So just gonna try to keep growing that. And yeah, if you have ideas, like if there are people out there who have ideas for projects they think would be really cool, or they're filmmakers or they're artists or they're doing something, I'd love to hear from them as well, or hear from you if you want to reach out to me or shoot me a DM or something. Because yeah, right now it's a lot of fun to find fellow travelers out there.
Yeah, and I think that's another important point to kind of make is, while this is like a big documentary and like, one of the, there's a lot to do about this. Like you've been making good content. You have a ton of video, content on YouTube and whatnot. So, if people like Lost Gods, they should definitely check out some of the other stuff. I think my favorite stuff of what you've had is like you had one on Batman and morality and that one was really cool because I think I did a thread about the what I call it the Batman morality and and I think we were both very much on the same wavelength, so a lot of really good content to go check out. So it doesn't just stop with Lost Gods, but North, thanks so much for coming on. This has been a pleasure. I really enjoyed chatting, and like to some degree, this is like a very selfish endeavor, my podcast, because I get to just talk with like really interesting people about cool stuff. But yeah, we'll get this up on the Substack and everything like that. And yeah, looking forward to following more, the content that you got coming out. I think, I like to think this is the beginning of something really cool. So
thank you. Yeah, me too. I think the best is yet to come.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. And as always, it was never over and we have never been more back. We'll catch you in the next one.